Good morning, everybody. I would like to introduce our two speakers today. We're going to be talking about water in the area, and if you have questions, we would prefer to put them in the chat if you're able to do that. Or if you can't do it in the chat, there is a section down on your Zoom picture, whatever screen, and it says reactions, and you can raise your hand, and what will happen is you will go to the first in line and I can identify you that way as wanting to ask a question, but you certainly couldn't put it into the chat if that's how you want to do it. So either way, you have two venues to ask questions. I'd like to introduce first William Boria, and he has worked for the Chautauqua County Health Department since 1994, most recently Director of Environmental Health Services. Prior to being appointed as a director, Bill headed up the health department's water program, including numerous water resource management and research projects. Before coming to the health department, Bill worked for a private civil engineering firm and for SUNY Fredonia doing water-related research. Bill is a licensed professional geologist and has a master's degree in geology and a bachelor's degree in geophysics, both from SUNY Fredonia. Thank you for being willing to do this. And you can start your presentation. Everybody, please put mute on, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mary, and good morning, everybody. It's appreciate the invitation to be here. You know, I just want to start by saying that we're really fortunate in Chautauqua County to have very talented staff working in the health department water program, including Emily Beers, who you'll hear from shortly about lead in school drinking water. And we're also have an outstanding partnership with the New York State Department of Health, their regional folks and their central office folks, and with DEC. So those partnerships play a lot into helping to protect our water resources in the county, in addition to having a really good relationship with our local municipal public water supplies. So I just want to point that out because it's a team effort in terms of you know, protecting and maintaining our water systems. So I'm going to just share my screen, see if this works okay. Okay, the third button from the left is the laser pointer. Cool, thank you, Emily. So we'll get right into it, but I'm going to talk about PFAS contamination of drinking water supplies. And PFAS stands for per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. All right. These are man-made substances, and they've been extensively, you know, produced and studied, used in a whole slew of different products in the world. Some of those include, you know, Teflon coating on cookware that was very popular a number of years ago, coatings on food containers, takeout food containers, water repellent coatings on outerwear, and firefighting foam, all kinds of things. So a little history of PFAS, you know, it was developed in the 1930s, and I think a lot of people can recall this, you know, better living through chemistry, and we still hear that a lot of times, and you know, and it's true, but sometimes, these things also have their negative impacts, and we're going to hear a little bit about that. So developed in the 30s, in the 40s, nonstick coatings, Teflon's used extensively in plumbing. I guess in the 50s is more water resistant products, and Gore-Tex, for example, came out in the 70s, and firefighting foams are also widely contain PFAS chemicals. So here's just a few photos of the firefighting foam, because we're going to hear a little bit more about that as we move on. And I want to draw your attention to the guy who's holding this funnel, spraying the foam, basically at children at, a school field days event. And this is common practice. It's commonly done, or was commonly done, in Chautauqua County and at other places. It's kind of like a giant slip and slide. So some of the health effects of PFAS, first of all, we're starting to really understand more and more as we progress, that there are health effects. What those exact health effects are, we're still learning. So, what are they? I kind of went through that already, but I do want to point out that in 2006, 8 major companies that produced PFOA and actually PFOS, there's a little typo there. Those are 2 of the more widely studied PFAS compounds. They got basically phased out of production. But we know that the PFAS chemicals are bad for you, or at least some of them are. And repeated long-term exposure can cause things like developmental disorders, and other problems, including problems with the thyroid and other things. The most widely studied, as I said, are PFOA. Oops, I'm going to go back. PFOA, which is perfluorooctanoic acid, and PFOS, which is perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. So interestingly, they, because they're so widely used, and they've been, used everywhere in all kinds of different manufacturing products, they are essentially found in, detected in small levels in the blood of humans, essentially all humans. And drinking water can also be a source where communities' drinking water supplies are close to a source, such as a manufacturing firm. They're primarily a problem in groundwater because groundwater moves so slowly. And, they move so slow, chemicals, not just PFAS, but other chemicals can increase in groundwater and become concentrated. And PFAS in particular, they don't break down readily. So once they're in the ground, they're going to stay there for a long time. So there's some health standards that EPA started looking at, and that wasn't until about 2009. They call them health advisory levels. They're not levels that can be, that are standards or that can be that are part of federal law. They're just advisory levels. And in 2009, they came out with a health advisory level for PFOA and PFOS. 400 nanograms per liter for PFOA, 200 nanograms per liter for PFOS. Now, a nanogram per liter is a really, really small amount. As a matter of fact, it's the smallest unit of measurement that's used in the drinking water industry. 1 nanogram per liter equals 1 part per trillion. And as a comparison, prior to the parts per trillion and health advisories coming out for PFAS, pretty much the smallest measurements that were used in the drinking water industry were parts per billion. And an example of a contaminant that we measure in parts per billion is lead. And 1 part per billion is equal to 1 microgram per liter. So 1 nanogram per liter is 100 times smaller than 1 part per trillion or 1 microgram per liter. We're going to take a closer look at PFOS and PFNA issues in New York State. And in order to do that, we're going to look at Hoosick Falls, which is located kind of northwest, or I'm sorry, northeast of Albany, across the Hudson River. It's a small community, serves about 4,900 people. And they have groundwater supply and they have basic treatment. So in 2014, the community, some residents raised concern about contamination issues. And in response, the village collected samples and they were analyzed for PFOA and PFOS, and they were determined to contain relatively high levels of PFOA and essentially negligible levels of PFOS. So if you remember, some of the health advisories started at 400 and 200. And then as we learned more about those compounds, they were actually decreased.
Oh, good. But you know what? I'm on a Zoom meeting
More to
right
come
now
on that in a minute.
with voters to talk about what.
But when they did identify these compounds, the health department immediately issued a do not drink order because we knew
Way.
that there were issues related to
You know what?
health-related
I
issues
signed up for automatic payment
Excuse
on
me, everyone, please
long time
mute
ago.
yourself.
For no, for our cell phone. Verizon handled our cell phone.
But moving right along.
You know what?
So
I'll
in
go down
September,
Verizon.
there we go. In September, so we had no regulations for PFOA or PFOS or any other PFAS compounds. And because they weren't regulated contaminants at the federal level or the state level, when that happened in Hoosick Falls, there was no mechanism that would trigger funding that could be provided to Hoosick Falls to address their problem. Interesting, this is very interesting, and this comes to light when I start talking about Mayville. They did identify a firm that was responsible, and they offered assistance to the village. So in 2016, and this is like the first step in regulating a contaminant, although this was done under emergency situation, that the governor classified PFOA as a hazardous substance. They knew it was present in the Hoosick Falls drinking water system. So they also became concerned about private wells that were in that area. And this is a map showing Hoosick Falls here in the middle, and then in the surrounding area, everyone is basically relies on private wells. And we've got this situation, similar situation across Chautauqua County. So if you notice these gray, they're tax parcels actually. Those are areas where concentrations were less than 2 parts per trillion for PFOA. The green areas are between 2 and 70, and the blue areas were above 70. So there was pretty much widespread contamination in this area. To address the problem in the village of Hoosick Falls system, they installed treatment. And it includes activated carbon, which are what these 2 big vessels are. And if you keep in mind what this looks like, this is, they installed these treatment vessels before the building was built. So they're actually in the process of building a covering over the treatment building, but it's not done yet. Looks like it's fall time, so they better hurry up because the winters are coming. So some of the statewide impacts that came out of the Hoosick Falls problem was PFOS and PFOA listed as hazardous substances. State Health Department conducts sampling of public water supply sources throughout the state in areas that were suspected to be in close proximity to an industry or an airport that could be a source for PFAS. And then, this whole time New York State was going through a regulatory process to develop a maximum contaminant level or a maximum allowable level of PFOA and PFOS in drinking water. And finally, in 2020, they came out with the final regulations, and they were adopted and implemented. Then in 2021, all public water supplies in New York State must now sample quarterly for PFOA and PFOS. And if after 2 quarters, if there's no detections, then the monitoring period is reduced. And I still want to emphasize that there is no federal regulation that limits the amount of PFOA, PFOS, or any other PFAS chemical in drinking water. So let's take a closer look at Mayville. So everyone knows where Mayville is. North end of Chautauqua Lake. It sits on top of a ridge, and this is a topographic map that shows, the ridge is kind of angled this way. It's the top of the ridge, and they serve a population a little under 2,000, and in the summer that increases significantly by well over 1,000 people or more. They did have a huge public water system improvement project going on. It was started in 2018 that included installing a new storage tank, drilling a new well, and installing a bunch of water mains. So these are pictures of the 3 wells that the village uses. These are the well houses, and these are high capacity pumps that are installed inside the well houses. They pump at about 150 gallons per minute each. So, they had a pretty ample supply of drinking water. Picture of their old treatment or their old storage tanks. And those were replaced with a brand new storage tank. It was taller to increase pressures in certain low pressure areas. And then in 2019, we did some initial sampling of two of the three Mayville wells and found that PFNA was present in two wells at levels between 88 and 130 parts per trillion. PFNA stands for perfluorononoic acid, which is, a sister compound of PFOA and PFOS. Interestingly enough, PFOA was pretty low. It was less than 5 parts per trillion, and there was no PFOS present in drinking water. So remember, we've only got regulations for PFOA and PFOS. We've got nothing for PFNA at this point. So we sampled the third well because that one hadn't been sampled, and we had anticipated that the third well would it was located about a half a mile from the other two wells. The other two wells are very close together. So we're thinking, okay, the third well, keep our fingers crossed, isn't going to contain any PFNA or any of the other PFAS compounds. Well, unfortunately, it did, and the levels in that third well were even higher than the other two wells. They were exceeded 300 parts per trillion. So we did the same thing that Hoosick Falls did. We issued a do not drink order for the village. And that was done on December 10th, 2020. And I'll just point out, okay, so here's the hill, the ridge, and their 3 wells are located in this area. Those dots actually represent the wells. And they were exploring for groundwater in this other valley. So these two valleys are not connected hydraulically. And they did end up drilling a well on the other side of the ridge. But it wasn't developed yet. It was a well casing in the ground. It had no pump in it. It wasn't, it was some distance away. It was more than a quarter mile. I think it was a half a mile away from the Mayville distribution system. And there was no treatment building. There was nothing there. So, what are the options that we have to eliminate this do not drink order? So the first thing we wanted to do was make available an alternative drinking water supply to those residents who were impacted, which ended up being bottled water. Then the next thing, okay, we've got this newly drilled well on the other side of the valley. It should be low in PFAS because it's not anywhere near the other one. So let's take a look at it. I'm gonna have to get moving a little bit on this. So they built a temporary well house, and then they ran a temporary line to the village's distribution system, and they had that up and running in 3 days. The village workers worked day and night to get this thing up and running, and they did a really great job. And then finally on Christmas Eve, we were able to lift the do not drink order. Well, what about private wells in the area? Here's kind of that ridge I was talking about. And then here's kind of where the highest well was located. We ended up sampling all private wells within 1 mile radius of the village's contaminated wells. And all of the wells that we sampled did not contain any PFOA, PFOS, or PFNA, no detections. DEC stepped in to do a contaminant investigation. Okay, where's it coming from? And our Region 9 staff were a huge help in that. They drilled monitoring wells, collected soil samples, water samples, and really did a very thorough analysis. They prepared a report, and that report identified, looked at a number of different potential sources, some furniture factories, a nearby brownfield, and then they keyed on a location behind the town of Chautauqua Municipal Building, which is the old Mayville Central School, that they used to do. Well, they did some fire training exercises with foam in that area a number of times. And here's a picture of what they, actually behind that building where they were having fire foam exercises. And they conducted these between 2014 and 2018 on 5 occasions. So, I mean, it's not like it was done every day. And, but it shows that how sensitive drinking water can be to contamination. In the meantime, they constructed a permanent building around their new well, permanent treatment. And similar to Hoosick Falls, they installed a treatment system on one of the contaminated wells. And this is it before it has a building around it. These vessels are about 11 feet tall, so it takes a big building to enclose that. This was actually brought online about in the middle of 2021. This is the inside of the building, and it's a big building to house these things, a huge expense. This is pushing $1 million. The village was fortunate that they had some emergency funding made available to them by the state to do this. So what's next? Mayville's got to look for another source. They've got 2 wells. They don't feel that that is enough to meet their peak demands, especially during drought. So they're actively looking for another well. New York State is evaluating the PFAS results that were collected from public water supplies in 2021. And they're going to look to see if PFNA is any kind of, widespread problem throughout the state, or is it somewhat isolated? Then they're going to repeat for PFNA what was done for PFOA and PFOS in response to Hoosick Falls. It's undoubtedly going to be regulated. These things take time. New regulations for PFNA, but what about other PFAS compounds? Because there are upwards of 5,000 different PFAS compounds. Right now in drinking water, we're only testing for about 30 of them. So, what other compounds are we going to find that could also be a problem? Here's my contact info, and I guess I'll turn it over to Mary and Lisa.
Thank you.
These were all the people. These were all the people that helped. I mean, like I said, huge partnership and a lot of cooperation on this project. And I'm sorry, then that's it.
Okay, great. That answered a lot of questions, but are there any questions of the people who, yeah, Michelle? Unmute. Okay, you're good. Uh-oh, I think we lost her. Oh, no, there you are. Michelle, you're okay.
Okay,
Did you?
can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Okay, I did have a question for Bill. It's not about what you just discussed, but I'm a new trustee in the village of Fredonia. And I have a question about the Northern Chautauqua Water District. And right now, the city of Dunkirk functions as the water supplier to the system. And I wanted to know, how would you feel of Fredonia's reservoir to be part of that system?
Well, first of all, Michelle, it's nice to meet you. It's, you know, that's, well, this is an involved question, but the short answer is that was one of the things that was recommended to the village years ago when we started talking about the North County Water District, because
Right.
we knew the village wanted to maintain their source, and they want to control their own destiny, and we can appreciate that. But so yeah, originally that's what was proposed, and that is still on the table.
Great. I see that you're going to be having a meeting, or the Northern Chautauqua County Water District, February 10th. So I will be attending that to ask that very question.
Super. Yeah, I would encourage anyone who's interested in learning more to attend those meetings.
And also Emily Beers, she is working with us right now. We did receive a grant on protecting our drinking water. And I was hoping maybe you could attend our next meeting on February 9th at 1 p.m. in the village of Fredonia, in the trustee room.
Yeah, I will try. I didn't attend the last one because I had a conflict.
Okay.
So let me just look at my calendar real quick. It's on the 9th.
Yes, at 1 p.m. It's at Village Hall on the second floor in the trustee room.
Yeah, I'll try. I've got a meeting. Let's see. But I'll try to get out of it and attend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Bill.
Thanks,
You're welcome.
Michelle.
Nice to meet you again.
Thank you.
Bill,
Nice meeting you too.
Oh, sorry. We have a question. You didn't mention any federal regulations. Would that help if there were more federal regulations for these
Well,
contaminants?
Absolutely. The way most drinking water regulations are promulgated is that they start at the federal level, because the federal government has more resources to do the research and to establish, you know, the value that they look at is they do not want to cause health problems for more than 1 in 10,000 people. So, you know, they have a lot more research capabilities than the state government, but so, you know, we anticipate the federal government will eventually enact some sort of regulations, but that could be some time off, and I don't know when. I would expect New York State to enact regulations that are going to cover PFNA before the federal government does anything with PFAS.
One other question, you mentioned a lot of products that have these contaminants in them, like just for instance, Gore-Tex, that kind of thing. When these products go into the landfill, does that pose a problem for contamination of water?
Well, when it goes into a Part 360 designed and constructed landfill, you know, they have triple barriers for contamination migration. So for the most part, there are no issues unless there's a breakdown in those boundaries, in those. So yeah, but then, you know, the issue comes up with landfills about the leachate that is collected from the landfills, and that leachate needs to be treated at a It's basically treated as a sewage treatment plant, and some chemicals are not removed by conventional sewage treatment plant processes. So that's something that I think is kind of new that people are looking at in developing new types of sewage treatment processes to address it.
Okay, let's go on to let Emily speak. Emily Beers started working for the Chautauqua County Health Department last year in February 2021 as a public health technician in water program. Emily also worked as a seasonal intern in the summer of 2016 in a beach program monitoring E. coli and harmful algae blooms in our county's lakes. Before working for the health department, Emily attended Bowling Green State University, where she obtained her master's in microbiology with a focus in freshwater algae blooms, and SUNY Fredonia for a bachelor's in environmental science. Thanks for joining us, Emily.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the introduction. I hope everybody is doing okay on this extremely snowy morning that we're having. And I'd just like to apologize in advance. I have a 6-month-old kitten that is very excited that I am not at work today. So you will likely hear her. You might even see her. So just ignore her. Like it was mentioned, I will be testing or presenting on lead testing in school drinking water. And most of what I will be presenting on today is regulations that came about in 2016 and 2020. And then all of the results that I'll be sharing are just specifically from 2020. Just a little background on the bill that was put into place. It was first signed on September 6th in 2016. And the law required that the New York State Health Department, which regulates subsequently all the county health departments below it, required that all public schools test all potable water outlets for lead contamination. And the maximum contaminant level set on that was 15 micrograms per liter. And micrograms per liter is also the same thing as parts per billion. And I'll be referring mostly to the level as parts per billion throughout the presentation. The initial regulation was put into effect immediately on September 6th, and it didn't really give schools that much of a head start because if the school had elementary school age children in it, they had to take their first samples by September 30th of that year. And then any middle school or high school age children, they had to take the sample by October 30th. So a little bit longer, but still only about a month and a half to coordinate these sampling testing. And the title was lead testing in school drinking water. And it was finally adopted fully in May 9th of 2018. So just the compliance scheduling for schools, as I stated, this was done initially in 2016, but that did not apply to New York City schools for some reason. Many New York City schools didn't start sampling until 2020. And this applied to BOCES centers as well, so the Boards of Cooperative Education Services. And it also applied to buildings that were owned or leased by a public school. So even if they weren't on school grounds, those still also had to be tested as well. And it is important to point out that the regulation does not apply to private schools, charter schools, or any schools on Indian Nation land, and it also does not apply to daycare facilities. We have quite a bit of schools in our county, Bemis Elementary, Pine Valley, just to name a couple, that are not on municipal water. They're actually regulated themselves as public water systems. So they have to do another set of lead and copper sampling as well under the LCR rule, so lead and copper rule. And none of that sampling counts toward this school compliance sampling. So they're actually doubly regulated under this law for lead at least. And then they do copper testing as well for the public water compliance. There are some exceptions to this rule. new buildings, anything built before January of 2014 can be deemed as lead-free. It has to be deemed as lead-free by a professional engineer or an architect. So basically that means that none of the plumbing, none of the faucets, none of the fixtures, none of the solder, literally nothing about whatever is servicing water to the faucet has lead in it. So there's no way for that lead contaminant to then get into the drinking water supply. It does not exempt them from specific outlets. So you could have, a lead-free pipe with lead-free solder that goes to a lead-free outlet, but there's other lead lines in the school. So it doesn't apply just to one specific drinking fountain or one sink in a bathroom. It has to be like the entire building or an entire wing, for instance. And there are exemptions to for renovated parts of the building. So like Westfield, for instance, they went through and did some asbestos remediation, but they also put on a whole new wing. Now, granted, this wasn't before 2014, but if that wing was deemed as lead-free, they wouldn't have to sample any of the outlets in that particular wing of the school. Some key elements of the regulation that I will be going on over, it's subpart 67-4, is monitoring, response, public notification, reporting, and record keeping. I will mostly be focusing on monitoring and response. A lot of the reporting and record keeping is done through HERDS, and all of that data is actually available to the public on the New York State Health Department site if you are interested in looking at more than what I present on today. So as I stated, the first round had to be collected in 2016, September 2016 for elementary age kids, and then October for the middle and high school. The second round was scheduled to be formed in 2020, but that was not kind of hard set. There were instances where samples were taken in 2018 and 2019 if it was deemed that the school should resample earlier than that kind of 4-year time span. After 2020, though, it was set to a hard every 5 years. Again, that could be determined to be done sooner if they thought it was necessary. Schools had to complete initial first draw sampling for the official compliance year for 2020. And like I said, that now includes the New York City schools that did not have to do the initial sampling in 2016. I will go more over what the initial first draw means. That's just a way to sample and the type of water that you get when you sample. Going just further into sample locations. So I'll refer from here on out to the sample locations as outlets. So that can cover sinks, drinking fountains, like even outside hose taps. So it's just easier to refer to them kind of blanketly as outlets. And those are anywhere on school property that could be used for drinking or for cooking. So anything that includes food prep, but that does not count stations that are used for like dishwashing. So any dishwashing sinks do not need to be sampled, as they're likely not to use a dishwashing sink as drinking water or as food prep. So like I was talking about, bubblers, drinking fountain, all classroom sinks, kitchen sinks, things that are in like teachers' lounges, nurses' office, athletic fields. I know a lot of places where they have like softball or baseball dugouts, sometimes they'll kind of have those hose spigots outside. Those would count too, just in case an athlete decided they wanted to fill their water bottle up with it. Those would need to be tested as well. Sample guidance. So this will be getting into what a first draw sample is. So all the samples need to be 250 milliliters and strictly cold water. They do not want to be sampling hot water because that can mess with the results. And the water has to be motionless for 8 to 18 hours. So basically overnight. It cannot be less than 8, but it also cannot be more than 18. So a lot of this sampling is done very early in the morning before any of the teachers or any of the students are on site. It basically has to be those, first drops of water that come out of the outlet that morning. And aerators should also not be removed. Some sampling does require the aerators be removed, like if you're sampling for bacteria, for instance. But when you're drinking water, you don't go up to the faucet that you're drinking on and unscrew the aerator before you fill your water bottle up. So they want those aerators on because, some of the old ones are made of lead before they sample those. And flushing is also not allowed as well, like when you would flush to take a bacteria sample. Superintendents are typically the single person that kind of designates what is going to be sampled and what isn't. So not every single outlet in the entire school that water comes out of will be sampled. And a lot of times they can designate a person as well. So like I was talking about before, places like Bemis Elementary or Pine Valley, they're on their own water supply, so they have designated operators. So in that case, the designated operator would help out the superintendent to determine which outlets are going to be sampled and which outlets don't really need to be under the regulations. So if they're deemed outside of the scope of regulations, the school has to have a plan that shows how they're not going to be used for drinking, or they're not going to be used for cooking, or that there's going to be signs posted that that specific outlet shouldn't be used for drinking on the off chance that someone wants to fill up a water bottle there. So just more on outlet guidance. So what falls under this needs to be sampled or this doesn't need to be sampled. So like I said, food washing sinks, ice machines, those the new bottle fill stations where you can stick your water bottle underneath and it comes out the top. Both in that case would need to be sampled, the part where you fill your water bottle and the part where it comes out of the drinking fountain, because those are technically two separate outlets, even though they're served by like one single machine. Hand washing sinks are optional. So you can see here, like I went to Westfield High School. This is what the sinks looked like in our bathroom. So you kind of press this button here and there's 3 and the water comes out, and it's kind of, the water was just always lukewarm. So it's kind of a mixture of hot and cold water. Places like that in a bathroom typically are not sampled because it's a mixture of that hot and cold water. And then a lot of times there'll be signs posted, not to fill up your water bottle in the bathroom. And 1, it's just not sanitary, and 2, because they're not tested. Dishwashing sinks are not applicable. Science lab sinks, that's kind of up to the superintendent to delegate. Those kind of fall in that gray area. I know when I was in lab, we were never allowed to have food or drink. And if we did, it was a water bottle and it had to stay up on your desk away from the lab sinks. So those typically are not used for drinking water purposes. Same goes for the bus garage. Those are not applicable. And tempered outlets. So again, that's where the water kind of mixes to make that lukewarm. It's not really hot. It's not really cold. Those are not to be used. And that's actually an EPA recommendation, not just a best guess. Collector qualifications. Any individual who is familiar or who is trained on the first sampling protocol. So this can include school staff members if they have gone through any training. Lab reps can come in. There's usually a fee for that, to have a courier physically come and take the sample and do the sampling for you. Or the lab consultants or school consultants as well can do that, as long as they're trained with what needs to be done. And the individual also needs to be sure of quality control. So again, getting that first drop out of the sink, making sure that they're only using cold water. And they also need to ensure that the chain of custody is correct. In some of these schools, you'll see they're taking 150 samples in one day. So they need to be sure that each sample matches up with the location that they're taking it at. And that can get kind of tedious and confusing, especially if it's early in the morning and you're trying to get your sampling done before teachers and school and students start to show up. Ultimately, though, this kind of falls on the superintendent or whoever they designate to kind of watch over the sampling and ensure that it's done correctly and it's all sampled in accordance with the regulations that were put into subpart 67-4. So moving on to results. So the action level, or the maximum contaminant level, like I spoke of earlier in drinking water, is 15 micrograms per liter, 15 parts per billion. Lead results that are less than or equal to, so that equal to is important. If it's exactly 15, it technically does not exceed the action level, so it's therefore deemed as a safe outlet, and there's no further testing or remediation that is required at that outlet. anything that exceeds the 15 parts per billion then has to get shut off or basically closed down so that there's no access to it, so that a student couldn't walk up and fill their water bottle up. And then remediation is required. And once that remediation is done, they actually come back and test it again to make sure that the remediation worked. And that will continue on until they either decide to completely remove that outlet or until it does fall below the 15 parts per billion. So there are a lot of steps put into place to ensure that none of these outlets exceed the drinking water standard. Samples can also be invalidated by the lab or by the person who collected it if they're suspected to be inaccurate. If they are invalidated, it's not just forgotten about, they have to be retested. So there has to be a viable result for every outlet that is deemed needed to be testing. So if there is an action level exceedance, so if the outlet does test over the 15 parts per billion, it's an immediate response. As soon as the result comes back, that water to that location is shut off, or, if it's a drinking fountain, there's a plastic bag put over it. It says do not use or out of order, something along that nature. And then the remediation takes place, or the discussion on whether or not to remove that outlet is taken. If it is on a large scale, there have to be plans in place to provide the students and the teachers with adequate drinking water. Most of the time, this is not an issue because out of the 150 outlets that are sampled, there's only like 5 to 10 that may exceed the action level. So it's not like the entire school is going without water. The test results need to be reported to the local health department. It is not up to the labs to send these results to us or to the state. It is on the school to kind of look things over and then send the results to us saying, we shut off all outlets that exceeded the action level of 15 parts per billion. This is what we're doing. And when that does happen, they have 10 days to notify the staff and then the parental relation to the student. So whoever is watching over the student of that school, just so that people are aware, we did have an exceedance, but we're working to fix it. They can still be used as hand washing or for cleaning purposes if they do exceed that 15 parts per billion, but signs need to be posted that explicitly express that it's not to be used as drinking water or as food preparation. So here is just some examples of signage. In a lot of these places, it's the little kids we're working about, elementary age students, might not always understand if you just have a sign that says, non-potable water, they're not going to know what that means. So a lot of times you'll see these signage, it'll have a clear picture and it'll say no drinking, so that they can visually see that they shouldn't be drinking this water. A lot of times, instead of removing the entire outlet, because that can be kind of a pain, they go in and they see, which part of the water line has the lead contamination. So whether it's the soldering or the pipe or it's the fixture itself, the faucet, the part that sticks out of the drinking fountain, they'll just go in and exchange that for lead-free plumbing materials, and then they'll flush that out and wait overnight, and then they can sample again to ensure that what they remediated actually took the lead out of the water. Some things to help if schools do kind of seem to have these higher lead levels are systematic flushing and engineering controls. So especially if you have a lower pH water, your water's kind of acidic, that can kind of leach the lead out of your lines if you do have that older lead lining. And then when it has a chance to sit in your pipes for extended periods of time like that, whether it's a long weekend or there's, Christmas breaks, spring breaks, Easter breaks, stuff like that, all that water is sitting in your pipes and that can kind of eat away and corrode at your pipes. So that facility flushing can help with that a lot. There's also point of use filters. that can take lead out of water that will hook right up to a faucet, or you can install them at the base of drinking fountains. They make those for several contaminants, and one filter can remove a whole slew of contaminants. I know there's a couple out there that will remove lead and PFAS, as well as a bunch of other different minerals and other heavy metals. So those can be used as well. But the main remedial action that the state especially pushes is supervision, education, and signage. So just making contractors, making teachers aware that, you know, the use of lead-free plumbing is obviously required now, but just education is your best tool. You know, so when something like this happens and an action level is exceeded, it's best just to get the word out there and fix it as quickly as possible. Record keeping, if a school does apply for the lead-free documentation, they have to keep record of that. There's waivers that have to be completed, and schools have to keep all of their records for up to 10 years. When surveys or inspections are completed, that's something that we can ask for, and that's something that actually would be a violation if they can't provide that to us. And copies have to go to local health departments and the New York State Education Department as well. So there are multiple people, multiple facilities, divisions that are keeping track of the drinking water in these schools. And best management practices. Obviously, like I said, you want to do flushing, but you can also keep up to date by cleaning. So those aerators do tend to kind of hold junk in them. You know, that's part of the reason why when we test water for bacteria, we remove them and we clean them. The routine flushing and only using certified lead-free materials is obviously the best management practice. Lead does occur naturally in the Earth's crust, but the chances of lead being in your drinking water naturally and not from the plumbing that you're using is very, very, very slim. You know, 99.9% of the time, it's going to be the materials you use, not that whatever well you tapped randomly has a lead slug in it that's pulling from the aquifer. Another thing that can be kind of pushed, especially on older students or teachers, is to let the water run for like 20 to 30 seconds before the drinking water or the food preparation water is being used. And that can kind of flush out the older water that was sitting in the pipes while the faucet wasn't in use. So here are just some results. So we have Westfield, Southwestern Elementary, Fredonia Elementary, and Milton J. Fletcher, which is an elementary school in Jamestown. And then I did a yearly average for, and then again, this is all 2020 data, just to kind of show you how some of these compare. Westfield is a combination, elementary, middle, and high school, all in one building. So this shows for the entire building, not just the wing that the elementary students are pretty much kept in. So you can see here, blue is showing the number of outlets that were sampled. So, you know, the bigger the school, the more outlets you're going to sample, obviously. And then in orange, it shows results that exceed the action level. So out of the 204 sites that were sampled at Westfield, 14 of the outlets only exceeded that 15 parts per billion. And all of the orange you see here, all of these orange outlets, all of these were remediated within the year 2020 as well. So these have all been fixed. And on an average of all these testing that was done in Chautauqua County, there was about 70 tested at each school, and about 9 of them exceeded the action level. So it's a pretty good percentage. And eventually, you know, that number will continue to go down as more remediation is put into place. You know, hopefully within the next decade, these will all be coming back, you know, as zeros for exceedances. But as we go on in time too, the regulations are also getting stricter. So we're just pushing and pushing and pushing to make drinking water safer for, you know, not only the students, but the teachers who work there every day as well. And then this is total averages. So number of outlets, again, that was right around 70 results. above the 15 parts per billion, coming in right around 9. So that's a percentage of about 18. So the county, as of 2020, had about an 18% failure rate for exceeding that 15 parts per billion. Really, the take-home message here is lead is dangerous. It is a toxic material. It's extremely harmful to humans, but it's especially harmful to the little humans, and the little humans tend to spend a lot of time at school. For some children, unfortunately, school is a haven from their home. So you want them to be as safe as they can be. And that starts with making sure that their drinking water is good to use. Pregnant women are also at a great risk for lead exposure. Lead can actually transfer through the placenta, so from the mother's bloodstream to the baby. We have babies being born that have blood level exceedances just because of what their mother was introduced to as well. It is important to point out, though, that a lot of blood level exceedances are not due to drinking water. It's actually very rare for a blood level exceedance in a child to be traced back to drinking water. Most of it is from exposure or ingestion, so lead-based paint or lead-based toys. And there is a lot of really great programs that can help families out and can help landlords out, that own buildings for remediation that they can apply for funding to get rid of that and to kind of educate on, safe paints to use and ways to safely remove the lead-based paint. Exposure has been linked to lowered IQ and behavioral problems. It can affect their kidneys, their brains, their nervous systems. So, really right off the bat, those first couple of years are super vital to the child's development. And, if they're having lead poisoning issues, that's going to cause a big problem. The most common lead exposure is through ingestion. And then this over here, this picture just kind of shows you different kinds of pipe. So you have lead, but you can tell it's kind of treated with this white stain here. I know a lot of you have probably heard of, the issues going on in Flint. A lot of Flint had these lead treated pipes. And, the water that they were using wasn't highly acidic. The water was used to the pipe and the pipe used to the water and vice versa. But then they switched their water supplies, which was actually one of the main triggers to cause such the high lead levels in their drinking water, because that treated lining of the pipe ended up being unuseful because they switched their water supply. So that's something that, not just our county, but everyone will have to look out for as municipal water supply boundaries are expanding. We do have, I think it's 8 schools that are on their own water. But if one day they were ever to be hooked up to a municipal system, that is a change in water supply. Some places, maybe switching from well water to surface water, and the chemistry of those vary very greatly. So that's something that will have to be watched out when there is a switch made over in a school of water supplies. And then this is just showing like the lead-based paint. One of the easiest ways to kind of point out the lead paint that you see is they call it like alligator skin. It kind of flakes and peels off in a very distinct pattern. But ultimately, the take-home message is that we want to see no lead poisoning. The only safe level of lead in blood is 0. No level at all is safe, especially in children and pregnant women. So new regulations are constantly being put into place every year. Even though this law that I presented on today was only, fully adopted in 2018, the state is already looking at updating it and making it more strict. Because currently the MCL is the 15 parts per billion, and the state is actually looking to reduce that to 5 and dropping testing from 5 years to 3 years. So just putting more strict regulations on drinking water to keep these children safe. And then for blood levels, it was reduced from 15 to 5, so that change has already come into effect. It was 15 in 2019, and then it dropped down to 5. And the CDC is recommending the 3.5 micrograms per deciliter in children under the age of 6. But that, like I said, that is a recommendation that has not been adopted yet by the EPA or by any of the state health departments, from what I could find. And then just kind of as a county average, about 100 children under the age of 3 every year test over that 5 micrograms per deciliter. And when that happens, you know, there is programs in place. Like I said, there's the HUD grant and CLIP, which is CLPP plus, the childhood-led primary prevention program, that can come in and do risk assessments of your home, and see, you know, like, oh, you have lead paint on your walls, or this toy has lead-based paint, or this doorway, and there are steps put into plan to remove that. So there are a lot of laws and regulations in place that, you know, want to protect the children and want to protect the drinking water, which is most important. There's a really great book about Flint, Michigan, actually, on how, you know, it was kind of first discovered and what they did and what they're doing to help remediate it. It's called What the
I think perhaps we lost her.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, what happened?
No. I'm not sure when she tried, maybe when she tried to switch, show us the book.
Maybe her Wi-Fi went down or something.
Okay. Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Shame.
Maybe you're muted, Marcia, if you're trying to say something. Oh, I had a few
She
questions.
was just about over, but
I do too.
We're at our hour, so if she doesn't get back on, I'll
maybe Bill can answer a question.
yeah.
Yeah, I can try.
Okay, one question about lead testing. Now, I know that before you go to pre-K or kindergarten program, the physician, well, people are asked for lead level, and it is not mandatory. Can you, I don't think it's not mandatory because I haven't been working in the school for a while. So, but have they changed that so to make it mandatory, or is it still, oh, there's Emily.
Emily, the question was asked about testing blood lead levels in children, and
so
so it is mandatory that kids 1-year-old and that they test kids that are 1-year-old and 2-year-old, but it doesn't always happen. So that's can be a problem. But it is, you know, it is required by the state health department.
Okay. All right. Well, Emily, great job. Thank you.
Questions? I have a question.
A question from Judy.
Yeah, I actually have several, Emily, but I wanted to know how you picked the schools, and very importantly, does the lead from old houses, does that get into our water supplies? And what resources are there to remove the lead? I know I live in a very old house, and I know that we probably have some lead pipes and things, and I'm very concerned of the school of Dunkirk because I know that that's a very, very old school. All of them in Dunkirk are old. And I'm just wondering, do they, you know, does the lead from the houses get into the water supplies? What resources are there to get the lead out? And do you or do you test the other schools, like specifically Dunkirk? And the reason why I'm concerned, because I do know kids in the Dunkirk area that have tested positive for lead. It's probably from the houses eating the lead paint, but we don't know, you know, anyway.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. My phone at the moment, I lost power. So my Wi-Fi, everything went away. But
Oh, wow.
so they do test Dunkirk. The Dunkirk was not in the yearly average for 2020 because they were not tested in 2020. Dunkirk was actually tested as their second round in 2019. There are often times backflow preventers that, you know, won't allow, like your question about, you know, with lead from your home or anyone's home get back into the water supply. No, that's not really an issue. And a lot of times municipalities don't have lead-based plumbing. It's mostly in home or the line that takes it from the
I don't know if I
municipality.
need them because I got Marcy and
But Kirk does test.
well, you start parking around Friday.
So in Dunkirk, you know, most of their schools are public schools. I think they have one private school down by the lake, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
But all
Yes,
public test. So all of Dunkirk's schooling falls into that category.
Okay. Where are those
Can I-
resources to get the lead out of your house?
Can I add something about Dunkirk's water?
Thank you.
Dunkirk does have a chemical addition that they add to the water at their water treatment plant. And that helps provide a coating that Emily talked about on the inside of plumbing that's, you know, present in homes or schools. And I'll also add that Fredonia also has similar treatment for lead. So those are things that are going to help reduce the problem in both communities.
Any more questions? Anything in the chat? Nothing in the chat. So anybody raise their hand for a question? Okay,
I
Judy.
still wanted to know how do you test your own house? Like, how could I test my house to see if there's lead in where would I go to get a test, or how would I do that?
So there are several labs in the area that both have courier services or that you can take samples to. So you'd have to contact them. The county personally doesn't have the ability to test for lead, but it's a situation where you could bring the bottles to us, and then we have a courier that comes every Wednesday to pick up samples of that nature, mostly nitrate samples. But that's a situation where you'd have to have the correct bottle to do that kind of sampling. But we do have a list of labs in the area. Envirotechnics, Microbac is out of Erie. There's a lab out of Buffalo that will also test for lead and copper. Those are resources in a list that I could send you if you would like. But it's pretty easy to do. It's just a matter of getting the right bottles and then sampling on the right day.
If I could just add to that, New York State Health Department rolled out a free lead testing program to anyone who's interested in participating. It was several years ago, so they allocated, I can't remember how much, it was like a couple $1 million for homeowners to test their water for lead. And I believe there is still funding for people to do that. So if they Google free lead testing in New York State, they should find the State Health Department website that'll guide them through that process. There's a very short application process. You choose a lab that's close to you. There's one at the Erie County Health Department lab is the closest for us. And they'll send you a bottle. They do everything over the mail. And anyone can participate, whether you're on a private well or not, or connected to a public water supply. It doesn't matter. So I encourage people to do that. And I'll also mention one other thing, that if your home was, or your plumbing was installed before 1987 and it contains copper pipe, you are very likely that those systems contain lead-based solder and could contain lead as well. So if your home or your plumbing was installed after 1987, chances are a lot better you're not going to contain lead.
Thank you. That's an important piece of information. Thank you. If there are no more questions, we're, run an hour. We try to make these programs 1 hour. Again, thank you to Bill and Emily. Very informative, and if people have any questions, you can send them on via email or which probably the best way if you think about something later on. So thanks again. Thanks to everybody who has joined us.
Excellent.
And, I will be sending out some other information about programs in the future to our membership. Thanks again.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone. That was great.
Thank
So
you.
I'll have it on YouTube soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.